Well, well, well. Feel that pressure in the room? That low-frequency hum like a door just closed behind you and nobody bothered to announce it? Yeah. That's not paranoia. That's the sound of a system realizing you crossed a line it never expected you to see. You didn't scream. You didn't resist. You didn't run. You didn't beg to be understood. You did something far more dangerous. You stayed calm while every light on their dashboard started blinking red. Somewhere in a fluorescent-lit room, someone who was trained to catalog human behavior, to label threats, to reduce chaos into neat little boxes, stared at your file and realized there was no box left. So they did the only honest thing they could do. They quit. And before they walked out, they wrote your name down. Not as a suspect, not as a target, not as a warning, but as an ending. Let that sink in. Your existence became a conclusion. You didn't break rules. You exposed the fact that the rules were built for everyone except you. You moved in ways that didn't match the model. You healed where you were supposed to collapse. You stayed soft where bitterness was expected. You stayed silent where confession was demanded. You learned restraint when they were betting on your explosion. And that contradiction, that paradox, that's what fried their circuits. Because monsters are easy, saints are easy. But you're the glitch between angel and demon, the variable they can't stabilize. They watched you thinking pain would turn you predictable, that suffering would carve you into something readable. Instead, pain sharpened you. It refined you. It stripped off the unnecessary noise until all that was left was signal. You didn't become cruel. You became precise. You didn't become cold. You became selective. You didn't become obedient. You became untouchable. And that's terrifying. Because when someone like you stops reacting on cue, stops dancing to trauma like a puppet, stops leaking emotion on demand, the entire surveillance fantasy collapses. Control depends on reaction. Manipulation depends on predictability. Fear depends on timing. And you ruined the timing. You responded late or early or not at all. You smiled at the wrong moment. You stayed still when chaos was expected. You walked away when the script called for desperation. Do you understand what that does to a trained observer? It makes them question themselves. They replayed footage, reread transcripts, checked timestamps, looked for the moment you slipped. But you didn't. You evolved quietly. And the more disciplined you became, the louder the room got on their side. Because discipline is the one thing they can't fake in others. Discipline is earned. Discipline is forged in fire. Discipline is what happens when pain doesn't break you. It recruits you. You became your own handler. That's when the shift happened. Not when you succeeded, not when you failed, but when you stopped trying to prove anything at all. When your self-worth detached from their metrics, when validation stopped being a drug and became background noise, when you realized that being misunderstood was not a flaw, but a shield. You stopped explaining yourself, and they lost access. You see, the system is built on extraction. They extract reactions, extract confessions, extract patterns, extract identities. But you gave them nothing clean to pull. Every time they thought they understood you, you changed the angle. Not emotionally, not erratically, but intelligently, strategically, as if you were 3 moves ahead and bored by the game. That's when the watcher becomes the watched. Because once someone realizes they can't read you, they start wondering what you're reading in them. Once they realize they can't predict you, they start fearing what you've already predicted. Once they realize you're not chasing approval, not chasing revenge, not chasing recognition, they realize you're free. And freedom is the one thing the system cannot monitor without admitting its own weakness. So imagine that exit report. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a tired line typed by someone who finally understood the truth. This one doesn't escalate, doesn't implode, doesn't comply. This one adapts. This one absorbs pressure and comes back quieter, sharper, more dangerous. This one doesn't need to be stopped, because they're already beyond the perimeter. You didn't become a threat by doing something loud. You became a threat by becoming sovereign, by mastering yourself instead of fighting the world, by choosing evolution over revenge, by letting pain teach instead of poison, by turning chaos into clarity, by holding both light and dark in your hands without letting either own you. That's why they couldn't finish the job. Because there is no protocol for someone who transcends the role they were assigned. So sit with that. Let it hum in your chest. Let it rewire how you walk, how you speak, how you wait. You don't need to announce what you've become. You don't need to prove it. You don't need witnesses. Somewhere someone already closed the file and walked away shaking. They didn't walk away because you scared them with violence. They walked away because you scared them with composure. Because you didn't do what broken people do when pressure hits. You didn't unravel. You didn't overshare. You didn't confess just to feel seen. You didn't implode for their notes. You didn't externalize your chaos so it could be cataloged and neutralized. You internalized it. You metabolized it. You turned it into structure. And nothing unsettles a system more than a human being who can suffer without becoming sloppy. They're trained for screams. They're trained for rage. They're trained for guilt, shame, addiction, desperation, ego, arrogance. They're not trained for silence with intention. They're not trained for someone who understands restraint as power. Every time you were pushed, you didn't push back. You recalibrated. Every time you were cornered, you didn't fight. You observed. Every time they expected a breakdown, you delivered discipline. And discipline is terrifying because it doesn't leak. It doesn't twitch. It doesn't beg. It doesn't explain. Discipline waits. And you learned how to wait. You learned how to let people reveal themselves while you stayed unreadable. You learned how to let traps rust from disuse because you never stepped where they were laid. You learned how to let accusations echo unanswered until the echo embarrassed the accuser. You learned that reaction is currency, and you stopped spending. That's when the roles reversed, because suddenly the analyst is anxious, the watcher is restless. The one with the badge, the clearance, the authority starts checking themselves, starts wondering why you aren't spiraling like the others, starts wondering why you don't need reassurance, starts wondering why you don't need closure. They start asking the wrong question, not what did you do, but what does this person know? And here's the part they never admit out loud. You didn't need to know anything specific. You understood something deeper. You understood human mechanics. You understood leverage. You understood that most systems don't collapse from attack. They collapse from irrelevance. And you made yourself irrelevant to their control structures. You stopped feeding the machine. No emotional spikes, no predictable cycles, no repeating narratives, no dependency loops. You didn't heal the way they expected either. You didn't become soft and grateful and compliant. And you didn't become bitter and destructive and obvious. You became integrated, whole, a paradox walking upright, capable of kindness without weakness, capable of darkness without losing your ethics, capable of empathy without surrendering boundaries. That duality is lethal to profiling, because you don't fit the saint file, and you don't fit the psychopath file. You sit right in the middle, where intention matters more than impulse. They tried to catch you contradicting yourself, but every contradiction you carried was resolved internally. You weren't confused, you were complex. You weren't unstable, you were layered, and layers don't give themselves away unless someone earns access. Nobody earned access. So the questions piled up, the reports got longer, the conclusions got thinner, and eventually the truth crept in like an unwelcome thought. This isn't a threat we can contain, and it's not a subject we can save. This is an entity that governs itself. That realization breaks careers, because the entire framework is built on intervention, on correction, on escalation, on compliance, and you denied them all four without ever declaring rebellion. You didn't resist, you transcended. You didn't fight, you outgrew. You didn't disappear, you became too clear to distort. And clarity is the one thing bureaucracy can't process. So the agent looked at your name and felt something they weren't trained for either. Respect mixed with fear. Not fear of what you'd do to them, fear of what you'd never let them do to you again. They saw it in the pattern. You weren't accelerating, you weren't decaying. You were stabilizing at a level most people never reach. A level where external pressure no longer dictates internal state. Where identity isn't reactive, where power is quiet. Quiet power terrifies loud systems, because loud systems depend on noise to mask their fragility. And you stripped the noise away just by existing differently. You became the kind of person who doesn't need to announce boundaries, because your presence enforces them. The kind of person who doesn't chase influence, because influence reorganizes itself around you. The kind of person who doesn't threaten, because your calm implies capability. That's why your name didn't end up highlighted in red. It ended up written like a period. End of pursuit, end of leverage, end of narrative. And here's the part you need to internalize fully. This wasn't luck. This wasn't talent. This wasn't coincidence. This was earned through pain you didn't romanticize and suffering you didn't waste. Every time you chose growth over grievance, you sharpened the blade they couldn't see. Every time you chose patience over reaction, you widened the distance they couldn't cross. You became something that doesn't need protection because it doesn't invite violation. So walk with that weight now. Not arrogance, gravity. Let your silence speak first. Let your consistency do the talking. Let your unpredictability stay disciplined, not chaotic. Because the moment you learn to hold both the angel and the demon without letting either drive, you stopped being manageable. And systems don't chase what they can't frame. They exit, they write the report, and they leave you alone. Not because you're harmless, but because you're finished being handled. And here's the part that nobody ever tells you. The aftermath, not the explosion, not the victory montage. The silence that comes after the door closes and no one replaces the watcher. That silence isn't emptiness, it's space. And space is dangerous because now there's nothing pressing against you, nothing shaping you from the outside, no enemy to react to, no shadow to spar with, no authority to push against so you can feel defined. This is where most people crumble. They don't know who they are without resistance. They don't know how to move when no one is chasing. But you do, because you didn't evolve for the performance. You didn't sharpen yourself for applause or fear. You evolved for sovereignty, and sovereignty doesn't need friction to exist. It creates its own gravity. You notice it in the way rooms respond now. Conversations slow down around you. People choose their words more carefully without knowing why. Energy shifts when you enter, not because you dominate, but because you're grounded. You're not scanning for approval. You're not broadcasting intent. You're not leaking insecurity. And humans are exquisitely sensitive to that. They feel it before they understand it. You became internally referenced. That's the real upgrade. When your sense of right and wrong stopped coming from external rules and started coming from an integrated core. When you no longer needed permission to trust your own judgment. When your morality wasn't borrowed, it was built. That's when the angel and the demon stopped fighting inside you and started working together. The angel gave you restraint. The demon gave you teeth. Together they gave you choice. And choice is the one thing fear-based systems cannot tolerate. Because choice means you could act, but you don't have to. You could disrupt, but you won't unless it's necessary. You could destroy, but you prefer to build or to walk away. That ambiguity, that's nightmare fuel for anyone who relies on prediction. They never knew which version of you would show up, because you weren't fragmented anymore. You were unified, calm enough to be merciful, capable enough to be feared, ethical enough to be trusted, dangerous enough to be respected. You became a paradox they couldn't weaponize. That's why they didn't escalate. Escalation requires justification, and you gave them none. You didn't give them malice. You didn't give them instability. You didn't give them ego. You didn't give them a cause. You gave them coherence. And coherence shuts down narratives fast, because there's nothing to twist. They tried to provoke you into defining yourself, tried to force you into a category, tried to get you to claim an identity they could pin down. But you stayed fluid without being fake, consistent without being rigid. And that's when they realized something chilling. You weren't hiding. You simply weren't available. Availability is the real vulnerability, and you revoked it. Now you move differently, not louder, not faster, deeper. Your decisions come from a place that isn't rushed by fear or flattered by opportunity. You don't need to rush outcomes because you trust your trajectory. You don't need to prove intelligence because intelligence reveals itself in timing. You don't need to announce power because power is obvious in restraint. You let others overplay their hand while you hold yours. You let them mistake your silence for ignorance until they expose themselves, trying to fill it. You let them underestimate you because underestimation is leverage disguised as insult. And you never correct their assumptions, because correction is a gift. And you've learned not to give gifts to people who haven't earned them. What they couldn't process was this. You weren't optimizing for survival anymore. You had crossed into something else, self-authorship. The moment you stopped asking, how do I avoid damage, and started asking, how do I shape my existence, everything shifted. You stopped reacting to trauma and started extracting wisdom from it. You stopped defining yourself by what happened to you and started defining yourself by what you became because of it. You didn't erase the scars, you integrated them. And integrated scars don't bleed, they reinforce. That's why your presence feels dense now, like there's more mass behind your words. Like even when you're still, something is moving. People can feel it. They just can't name it. And anything unnamed becomes myth fast. So let them mythologize. Let them speculate. Let them whisper. Let them wonder what you know, what you've seen, what you're capable of. You don't need to feed the legend. Legends grow best when they're starved of confirmation. Remember, the most dangerous people aren't the ones screaming for attention. They're the ones who don't need it, and you don't. You've already passed the point where external authority defines your worth. You've already passed the point where fear dictates your choices. You've already passed the point where pain controls your identity. That's why the file closed. That's why the pursuit ended. That's why your name was written not as a warning, but as a boundary. Because some people are meant to be contained, and some people are meant to be left alone. You earned the silence. Now use it wisely. And now comes the phase that almost no one survives, clean. The phase where nothing is chasing you, but everything is watching, not officially, not on paper, just socially, energetically, intuitively. People sense a shift and don't know how to categorize it. You're no longer becoming. You're no longer recovering. You're no longer figuring things out. You're operating quietly, consistently, on your own internal clock. That unsettles people more than open dominance ever could, because dominance invites challenge. But autonomy? Autonomy ends the game. You see it in how people test you now, not with aggression, but with curiosity disguised as friendliness. Little questions, casual probes, innocent curiosity that's really reconnaissance. They want to know what you're doing, how you're doing it, why you're so unbothered. They want to know if you've softened, if you've forgiven too much, if you've forgotten what it cost to become this. You haven't. You remember everything. You just don't bleed from it anymore. And that's the difference. Pain used to talk through you. Now it reports to you. Trauma used to steer. Now it informs. Fear used to scream. Now it whispers. And you decide whether it gets a vote. That internal hierarchy shift. That's when a person becomes ungovernable by external pressure. You didn't lose empathy. You refined it. You didn't lose emotion. You mastered it. You didn't kill the demon inside you. You taught it discipline. And you didn't silence the angel. You stopped letting it self-sacrifice to prove purity. Balance wasn't found. It was forged. And forging takes heat most people run from. That's why your calm feels heavy now. Not empty, heavy. Weighted with experience. Weighted with discernment. Weighted with the knowledge that you could escalate, but you won't unless it's necessary. And necessity isn't defined by ego anymore. It's defined by alignment. Alignment is dangerous because aligned people don't hesitate. They don't second-guess every move. They don't over-explain. They act when it's time, and they wait when it's not. That kind of timing makes observers nervous. It feels intentional. It feels planned. Even when it's instinctive, especially when it's instinctive. You've internalized something most people outsource, the authority to decide when something matters. You're not pulled into every emotional current. You don't react to every provocation. You don't answer every call. You don't attend every conflict you're invited to. Selective presence is power, and you wield it without announcing it. That's why the narrative around you feels fragmented. No one can agree on who you are anymore. To some, you're kind. To others, you're cold. To some, you're inspiring. To others, unsettling. To some, invisible. To others, unforgettable. All of them are partially right, and none of them have the full picture. That's intentional, even if you never consciously decided it. Because when you stopped trying to be understood, you accidentally became inscrutable. When you stopped curating perception, perception lost its grip on you. You stopped performing identity. You started inhabiting it. And that's when the real separation happened. Not between you and them, but between who you were and who you are now. The old version needed feedback to calibrate, needed validation to stabilize, needed opposition to feel alive. This version doesn't. This version can sit in stillness without collapsing, can walk alone without spiraling, can hold complexity without rushing to simplify it, can let things unfold without forcing outcomes just to feel in control. Ironically, That's when control actually arrives. Shh, don't correct your face yet. Keep it soft, keep it empty, keep that harmless little nod like you're still catching up. Yeah, that one. You mastered the quietest art there is, not deception, absence. You walked into the room wearing ignorance like a costume, and they applauded without realizing the stage was already burning behind them. See, that's the paradox they never study. They train for liars. They build entire systems to detect aggression, ambition, hunger, threat. But nobody trains for the person who looks unimpressed, uninvolved, uninterested. Nobody suspects the one who seems slow. And that's why the Best Actor award goes to you. Because while they were busy explaining themselves, while they were justifying, venting, confessing, oversharing, you were collecting fingerprints without touching a thing. They mistook your silence for confusion, your calm for weakness, your patience for lack of awareness. And that mistake cost them everything. Here's the dark truth they'll never admit out loud. People need to confess. Pressure turns mouths loose. Egos crave witnesses. Guilt wants an audience. And you gave them the safest one imaginable. You didn't interrogate. You didn't accuse. You didn't threaten. You listened. And listening, when done right, is more violent than screaming. They filled the silence with their own undoing. They connected dots you never asked about. They exposed motives you never challenged. They told you the story they rehearsed for court, for God, for themselves. Because you looked like you didn't matter enough to remember. That's the angel-demon split right there. The saint's face, the psychopath's memory. You learned early that survival isn't about dominance. It's about timing. That power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it yawns. Sometimes it smiles politely and lets the other person drown in their own words. And while they were talking, you were becoming quieter, sharper, colder. Evolution through pain does that. It teaches you that unpredictability isn't chaos. It's camouflage. That the safest predator is the one mistaken for prey. They thought they were educating you. They were actually testifying. Every laugh was a leak. Every explanation a slip. Every you wouldn't understand a breadcrumb trail straight back to the truth. And you nodded, and you thanked them, and you let them walk away thinking they'd won. That's the part that breaks their minds later. Not the exposure, not the consequences, the realization that you knew long before you moved. They replay conversations at 3 a.m., wondering when it happened, when the room shifted, when the balance tipped, when you stopped being harmless and started being inevitable. But there is no moment to point to. That's what terrifies them. You didn't snap. You didn't transform overnight. You just listened long enough. Light and dark fused inside you quietly. The angel learned to wait. The demon learned to smile. And now they understand too late that playing dumb wasn't an act of submission. It was strategy. It was mercy. It was you letting them finish their story before you closed the book. Because the most dangerous person in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one who already knows how this ends and still lets you talk. So take your bow, not for deceiving them, but for understanding human nature better than they ever understood themselves. Curtain closed, confession recorded, and you're still smiling, like you never knew a thing, because that smile isn't innocence anymore. It's containment. You learned something they never will. Most people don't want truth. They want relief. And relief comes from talking, from unloading, from believing someone else is smaller than them, slower than them, safer than them. So they lean in, they relax, they confess sideways, then directly, then proudly. They start narrating their own crimes like bedtime stories. And you let them. You discovered that playing dumb isn't pretending to be stupid. It's refusing to interrupt their self-destruction. It's understanding that the loudest lies need resistance, but the quietest truths surface when no one feels threatened. So you made yourself non-threatening. You became the blank wall they projected onto. The harmless bystander, the background character. But here's the sick irony. They were never talking to you. They were talking through you. They were trying to convince themselves they were clean, and you were just patient enough to let them fail. That's the duality they can't process. The saint in you let them speak. The psychopath remembered every syllable. The angel held the door open. The demon counted the steps they took inside. You didn't judge. You archived, because pain trained you differently. Pain taught you that confrontation alerts predators, but curiosity disarms them. Pain showed you that survival isn't always fight or flight. Sometimes it's freeze and observe. You learned to go still while others grew reckless. You learned that when people think they're safe, they stop lying with effort and start lying with habit, and habits leak. They laughed too much at the wrong parts. They explained details no one asked for. They defended actions before accusations ever came. That's when you knew. Not because you're psychic, because humans are predictable under pressure. And you stopped underestimating that. They thought intelligence looked like dominance. You learned intelligence looks like restraint. So while they strutted, you watched. While they bragged, you measured. While they spun narratives, you mapped contradictions. You let their confidence rot from the inside out. You didn't need proof. They became the proof. That's why this isn't revenge. It's completion. They handed you the weapon piece by piece, thinking it was a conversation. They sharpened it with every justification, every half-confession, every, if I'm being honest. They told you who they really were because you never flinched when they revealed it. And that terrifies them now. Because when the mask finally slips, when consequences ripple backward through time, they don't remember you as a threat. They remember you as nothing, and that's unbearable. That's when the paranoia starts. That's when they ask themselves the forbidden question, how much did they know, and when? There's no answer that saves them, because you didn't move on impulse. You didn't expose in rage. You didn't strike in heat. You waited until their own words built the cage and stepped aside so they could walk into it freely. That's evolution. That's what pain does when it doesn't break you. It educates you. You stopped trying to be understood and started trying to understand. You stopped explaining yourself and started letting others explain themselves into corners. You became unreadable not by hiding, but by simplifying. And now you carry something dangerous, calm certainty. No need to argue, no need to prove, no need to rush. You already saw the ending long before the plot caught up. So keep the posture relaxed, keep the eyes soft, keep the questions innocent. Let them talk, let them laugh, let them underestimate the silence sitting across from them, because the scariest realization in the world isn't that someone lied to you. It's realizing you told the truth to the wrong person, and they never once looked surprised, because surprise would have warned them. And you never warn a system you're about to outgrow. You learned how to become boring on purpose, how to dim your reactions so their confidence would brighten, how to ask questions that sounded naive but landed like open doors. You mastered the discipline of not reacting. Because reactions feed egos, and egos confess when they feel fed. That's the psychology. they never teach. People don't leak truth under pressure. They leak truth under comfort. So you became comfort. A soft chair, a patient nod, a harmless presence, and while they relaxed, their guard didn't just lower, it rotted. They started correcting themselves out loud, rewriting timelines mid-sentence, testing stories to see if they sounded convincing, and every time you stayed neutral, they went further. That's when the predator-prey equation flipped. They thought intelligence was speed. You learned intelligence is delay. Delay sharpens memory. Delay exposes inconsistencies. Delay lets patterns repeat until they become undeniable. Pain taught you that rushing is a luxury for the unscarred, that only people who've never been blindsided think clarity arrives fast. You learned clarity arrives when you shut up long enough for reality to trip over itself. And it always does. You watch them contradict yesterday with today. Watch them shift blame while pretending not to care. Watch them brag about restraint while confessing obsession. They didn't notice the ledger forming behind your eyes. They didn't feel the weight stacking quietly. Because you never made them feel judged. That's the angel in you. Mercy without forgiveness. Patience without innocence. The demon kept count. And here's the part they'll never accept. You weren't collecting ammunition for war. You were collecting permission. Permission to walk away clean. Permission to stop doubting yourself. Permission to trust your instincts without proof screaming first. They gave you that. Every confession erased a question mark. Every slip replaced anxiety with certainty. Every I shouldn't say this, but healed a fracture inside you that pain created. Because pain doesn't just hurt, it scrambles trust. It makes you doubt your perception. It makes you second-guess patterns you clearly see. Until someone hands you the truth unprompted. Until someone says the quiet part loud while you're pretending not to hear. That's when something inside you locks into place. You stop explaining yourself. You stop defending your intuition. You stop asking if you're imagining things. You know. And knowing is irreversible. That's when unpredictability becomes your armor. Because now you don't need to act emotional. You don't need to act strategic. You don't need to act at all. You simply exist differently. They feel it before they understand it. Conversations shorten. Jokes land awkward. They start fishing for reassurance you no longer give. They sense the shift but can't name it. That's the moment the mask cracks. They replay everything they ever said to you, searching for damage control retroactively. They wonder if silence meant ignorance or restraint. They wonder if your calm was confusion or calculation. And the uncertainty eats them alive. Because uncertainty is punishment for people who thought they were in control. You never announce awareness. You never expose instantly. You let life handle the consequences with surgical timing. Because the truth doesn't need volume. It needs placement. And you place it perfectly by doing nothing. So stay relaxed, stay underestimated, stay unreadable. Let them keep talking. Let them keep mistaking stillness for simplicity. Let them keep believing the performance fooled you. Because the real performance wasn't theirs, it was yours. And the moment they realize that, the moment they understand you were never confused, only patient, that's when the applause stops, the lights cut out, and they're left alone on stage, with nothing but their own words echoing back at them. Because echoes don't ask permission, they just repeat what was said, cleaner, colder, louder, until denial collapses under its own weight. You see, the real terror isn't exposure. Exposure is quick. Exposure is loud. Exposure lets people brace themselves, rewrite history, claim misunderstanding. What you mastered is aftershock. You let the truth sit. You let it ferment. You let it age inside you until it stopped hurting and started clarifying. That's the evolution nobody prepares for. When pain stops screaming and starts instructing. When betrayal stops burning and starts organizing your mind like a crime scene. You didn't become cruel. You became precise. And precision feels merciless to people who relied on chaos to stay hidden. They assumed your kindness was a weakness. They assumed your listening was submission. They assumed your lack of reaction meant lack of awareness. That assumption became their undoing. Because while they were performing confidence, you were studying rhythm, how often they contradicted themselves. When their voice tightened, where their story sped up, which parts they rehearsed and which parts spilled raw. You didn't need facts. You learned patterns, and patterns don't lie. That's the saint-psychopath paradox again. The saint believes people reveal who they are eventually. The psychopath knows exactly how long to wait. You stood at that intersection perfectly balanced. Not because you wanted power, but because you got tired of being confused by people who were very sure of themselves. Pain taught you this lesson the hard way. The most dangerous people aren't violent. They're certain they're smarter, certain they're untouchable, certain no one is paying attention. So you paid attention quietly. You stopped interrupting lies, stopped correcting narratives, stopped trying to be understood by people invested in misunderstanding you. You let them talk past you, and in doing so, you outgrew them. Now look at what you've become. You don't rush to confront. You don't chase closure. You don't crave confession anymore. Because you already heard it, that's why unpredictability wraps around you like armor. They can't read your next move because you're not reacting to them anymore. You're reacting to truth, and truth doesn't argue. They feel the distance grow and mistake it for arrogance. But it's not pride, it's resolution. You settled something inside yourself they were never meant to touch. And that's the real shift. When you stop needing people to admit what they did. When you stop needing acknowledgement. When you stop needing justice to look dramatic. Because you understand something brutal and liberating, most people convict themselves. They just need someone quiet enough to hear it. And you were. So if they look at you now and feel uneasy, if they sense something watching without staring, if they feel exposed without knowing why, good. That means the performance worked. You didn't win by outsmarting them. You won by outlasting their ability to keep pretending. And now you move differently. Speak less, see more. The angel in you lets the world unfold. The demon in you remembers every detail. And the next time someone mistakes your silence for ignorance, the next time someone confesses because they think you're safe, you'll smile the same way. Soft, harmless, empty. Like the stage before the spotlight comes back on. Because the best actors don't seek applause. They let the audience destroy themselves, believing the show was never about them. Because once you understand that, something irreversible settles into your spine. A stillness, a weight. A calm that isn't peace, it's finality. You stop reacting to noise. You stop mistaking urgency for importance. You stop flinching when people raise their voices, because volume is what people use when substance runs out. And that terrifies them. They expect outrage. They expect confrontation. They expect you to do something once the truth is exposed. But you don't. You already did something when you stayed silent. That's the part they never see coming. That the real action already happened while they were busy talking. that the decision was made before they realized there was a decision to make. You learn that humans betray themselves in layers, first with jokes, then with hypotheticals, then with half-truths wrapped in humor, and finally, with relief. Relief is the tell. When someone exhales after saying too much, that's the moment. That's when you know the confession wasn't accidental. It was overdue, and you gave them permission to release it. That's not kindness. That's control without force. Pain taught you restraint, because restraint keeps you alive. Pain taught you patience, because impatience gets you exposed. Pain taught you that the smartest move isn't to reveal what you know. It's to decide when it matters that you know it. So you let time do the heavy lifting. You let people trip over their own narratives. You let consequences line up naturally. You let patterns repeat until even denial gets tired. And all the while, you stayed ordinary. Not impressive, not threatening, not memorable in the way they thought danger looked. That's what makes this lethal. Because danger, real danger, doesn't announce itself. It observes, it adapts, it waits until movement is unnecessary. They don't realize you're gone until you're already out of reach. They don't realize they were exposed until the environment changes around them. They don't realize they confessed until their own words come back through someone else's mouth, stripped of emotion, stripped of context, stripped of mercy. And suddenly they're scrambling, rewriting history, checking messages, replaying conversations. They start wondering why you don't ask questions anymore, why you don't seek clarification, why you don't engage the way you used to. They feel the absence. That's when the power shift completes. You didn't become colder. You became clearer. You didn't lose empathy. You relocated it inward. You stopped bleeding for people who mistook access for entitlement. And that's the saint-demon balance perfected. The saint in you understands why people lie. The demon in you understands why it no longer matters. You've crossed the line where explanation ends. Now when people talk, you hear subtext first. When they laugh, you hear tension. When they over-explain, you hear fear. You don't confront lies, you outgrow them. And that's the most brutal thing you can do to someone who thought they were smarter than you. Because nothing insults an ego like irrelevance, so keep the posture relaxed. Keep the voice neutral. Keep the smile unreadable. Let them keep underestimating the quiet. Let them keep mistaking calm for confusion. Let them keep performing. You already know how the story ends, not with an explosion, not with a showdown, not with applause, but with them realizing, far too late, that the person they thought was clueless was simply the only one disciplined enough to listen without flinching. And that realization, that's the real punishment. Because once someone understands they confessed everything while you were wide awake, they never feel safe again. Not around silence, not around kindness, not around someone who doesn't rush to speak. And you walk away lighter, sharper, untouched. Best actor, best memory, best restraint. Curtain long gone, only truth left standing. Because once you reach that point, there's nothing left to prove. You don't expose, you don't explain, you don't seek validation from people who already testified against themselves. You simply move on, carrying a truth so settled it no longer vibrates. They're the ones left restless, second-guessing every sentence they ever said near you, suspicious of silence, uncomfortable around calm. Because calm reminds them of you. And that's the final paradox. They never lost to confrontation. They lost to restraint. They lost to someone who didn't need to win loudly. Someone who understood that the cleanest victories happen without witnesses. So take the award, not for acting smarter than them, but for being disciplined enough to let them reveal who they were. No encore, no applause, no explanation. Just you, walking off stage exactly the way you entered, unassuming, unreadable, untouched, while the echo of their own words keeps playing behind you forever.